Welcome to Lab 2, build your VPC and launch a web server. We're looking now at task 1, create your VPC. So in this task, we'll use the VPC and more option in the VPC console to create multiple resources, including a VPC, an internet gateway, a public subnet, and a private subnet in a single availability zone. This will include 2 route tables and a NAT gateway. In a later task, we'll add to this by adding another availability zone and resources within that. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and go to VPC, and I can get there in multiple ways. You can see the link here because I've been there recently. I've got a link over here, or I can just click here in the search field and find the VPC right here. And that will open up the VPC console dashboard. So what I want to do at this stage, I can hit create VPC, or I can go take a look at the VPCs I have. Let's look at what we have first so we know where we're going with this. We'll go to VPCs, and you can see that we already have 2 VPCs in here. Now, what I want to do is not use those, but just be aware they're there, and they include route tables, etc. So when you're looking a little bit later, we're going to see these resources in our console. We'll see a way of excluding the view of those. Let's click Create VPC. And in the VPC settings, if I leave it here on VPC only, you'll see that that's all it's going to create is a VPC. So very important to click the VPC and more. And what that's going to allow me to do is create the additional resources, and I can customize it to the size of the project. So let's go ahead and name this. So we can see down here in this step here, 6, we're going to name this lab. And so we'll change this to lab. And what we're going to see over here is that it adds that name to each of the resources. So this auto-generates a tag for all the resources that will follow. Next, what we want to do is set the IPv4 CIDR block, and I'll go ahead and copy and paste that in so I get that accurate. And then I can just copy and paste that in. I already had it, but it's a good idea to plug it in. Sometimes it'll look like the information's there and it's kind of gray. That means it actually doesn't have information. It's just giving you a sample. So it's not a bad idea to just go and copy and paste. We're going to leave IPv6 turned off, so we won't support that, although you can see that it is supported in VPCs. We're just not going to use it. Now, when we come down here, what we want to do initially is set up a VPC with only one availability zone. So I'll click on that. And you'll notice that I could customize this and select an availability zone. We're going to leave it set for the first availability zone. Bear in mind that availability zones, there are multiple availability zones in any region. This one has 6, but if you were to select other regions, we wouldn't have as many. When we look down here, we can see that we only have 2 possibilities: 0 subnet, public subnets, or 1. So in any given environment, you don't have to have public subnets, and you don't have to have a private subnet, but you will need a subnet or you won't be able to launch resources. You can see in the lab here, we're going to leave both of those set to 1. So those are the minimum. And then what we need to do is expand the customized subnets so that we can customize IP addresses. If I scroll up to the top here and take a look and show the details, currently, these are the IP addresses, ranges, and CIDRs that are going to be used for those subnets. You can see they don't match what I need. And that's why I need to customize that. So let's go ahead and customize those CIDR blocks. And again, probably best to just go ahead and copy and paste that in. So that is for our first CIDR. That's for US East 1A, and you can see that right there. Here's our, I said CIDR for our first subnet, and this is our second subnet. This is for the private subnet. The addresses that they provide in the labs ensure that the addresses are not overlapping. It's not creating overlapping blocks of addresses. So if I were to do something that would create that situation, so for instance, if I use the same value here and here, I will see an error message pop up below. And I don't see it initially, but if I were to go ahead and try to use this, this would generate an error. I'm going to go ahead and put that back to where it should be at. So I don't create one. There we go. Now, let's go ahead and see what else we're supposed to do. We do want a NAT gateway. Now, with the NAT gateway, we'll only need one. We're going to put it in our one AZ only. And notice that we're not using an S3 gateway because this implementation doesn't require the use of an S3 bucket. So we don't need a gateway to provide the ability for our resources to interact with our bucket. We don't have one. So we can just set that to none. So we have a single NAT gateway and no VPCs. And also note that we want to enable DNS host names and DNS resolutions. So that ensures that our resources that are launched in the VPC do get a DNS name. We'll see that a little bit later. You can provide more tags if you like. So if you want to have some project tags, maybe for specific departments or specific projects, we're going to leave that off. And so when I look over here, what I want to do is review this preview. And if I look here, it tells me what I should be seeing. So I can see lab VPC here. And then for the subnets, I should have a US East 1A with lab subnet public 1. And there it is. And there's lab subnet private 1, both in US East 1A. When I scroll over this way, I can look at the rest of my resources. For my route tables, I'll have a lab RTP public route table. And this routes to the lab internet gateway, which I can see over here. And you can see that there. And you'll also notice that when I hover over these, sorry, make it hover, there it goes. That shows me what's connected. And so when I hover over the lab VPC, you can see how it, there we go. It shows that there are the two subnets that are connected with that. If I hover over the name of the resource, the public subnet resource, I can see that it shows the route table that's connected to it and the lab internet gateway. When I hover over the lab private subnet, you can see that it's pointing to the NAT gateway, which is appropriate because that's what we're using it for. So you can see this allows me to see what's going to be created and provides IP addresses where appropriate. So if all looks good, matches everything I see here, then I can go ahead and go to the bottom, hit create VPC. And what I'll see very quickly are the resources being created and the resource IDs, and these are clickable. So at this point, I can click on these IDs, and that would open in the console so I can review and see if it's how it came out. Note that we're going to have a little bit of wait time for the NAT gateway because that takes a bit of time to create. It is a compute resource, so it's going to be generating. The generation is going to take a little bit longer. And then once it creates that, it'll be able to create the rest of these because without the information that we see in here, the route table with the routes could not be created. So it does this in an orderly fashion. So we'll go ahead and pause the video and then come back when this is complete. Okay, we're back and we can see that our VPC workflow is complete. And we could click on the View VPC. And here we can see that resource map. So I'll go ahead and close this and then expand this a little bit so we can see the full map. And this should match what we saw earlier. So we have our lab VPC with the appropriate IP address range that we configured early on in the lab right there. And then looking at our subnets, we have the lab subnet public 1 in the US East 1A with the appropriate IP address range. You can see that here. And then for the private subnet, we can see that as well with the appropriate IP address range. And then we can see the route tables that were created. So again, when I hover over the name of the subnet, I can see that we have a lab route table with one subnet association, 2 routes included. That means that that subnet or that route table's explicitly associated to this subnet here. And we can see the 2 routes that are included, and those 2 routes, one of them will be to the lab internet gateway. So that's an internet route for that public subnet. The second route is always going to be, and it's really your first route. Your first route is always your local route that routes traffic to all resources in the VPC. And so this one, no exception here. We can take a look at this private subnet with this lab route table private 1, only associated here. And it has 2 routes with the local. So that means traffic can, it's a route table that provides routes to every resource in your VPC. And then that's your local. And then the second route is taking us to the NAT Gateway. And that NAT Gateway has an elastic network interface with one elastic IP, because that's what you need for a NAT Gateway. That NAT Gateway we're going to see in a moment is actually launched within the public subnet. So when I expand here, let's go take a look at that. Here's our NAT gateways. I'll select it, and we can see that that was launched in the public subnet. Again, the goal is for resources in the private subnet to be able to send traffic to the NAT gateway in order to perhaps do an update, perhaps provide the ability for it to interact with another server outside of the VPC, etc. And that NAT gateway has a primary public IP address, which allows it to interact across the internet. All resources in your VPC will have private IPv4 addresses. This also has that ENI that we mentioned earlier, that elastic network interface. So when I click on that and take a look down here, we can see the network interfaces. That's the elastic network interface, or ENI, excuse me. And so you can see it right there. And then if we look down here, we get our details. It's a NAT gateway interface type. We knew that already. It's all within our VPC. Now, when we come down here, we'll see the IP addresses. There's that public IP. And I want you to note that because we enabled the DNS on the environment, the DNS host names and DNS resolution, you can see that even the NAT gateway gets a DNS, an IPv4 DNS on the private. It also gets a public IPv4 DNS. And you'll note that that DNS in part is composed of the IP address by default. You can override that, but that's in general how it is done unless you change the settings. So there you have it. We have the NAT gateway. And then if I want to take a look at those other resources, one of the nice things that we can take a look at when we go back over to our VPC and we take a look here, we can filter. So if I select all VPCs, I'm going to see everything. Here's my lab VPC. It gives me all my details. But if I'm going to exclude the irrelevant VPCs, I'll come over here and select lab VPC, which provides a filter at the top, which hides or masks the irrelevant information. I only want to look at the resources for lab VPC. So when I click subnets, I will only see resources relevant to that lab VPC. I'm not seeing any subnets here, so let's clear filters and see what happened there. Okay, and if we take a look here, we're not seeing the subnets, right? Now, why do you think that is? Here I can see that I have on the VPCs and look at my resource map, I can see the subnets here. But when I take a look here under subnets, I don't see them. Well, let's try a refresh and see what happens. And now they're displayed. So one of the things you want to be mindful of is that these console windows sometimes need to be refreshed. What that in fact does is the AWS Management Console on your behalf sends an API call to the VPC service and requests, as a GET request, to provide a list of the information I'm asking for, which in this case is the subnet. So it provides a list of subnets. So now when I select this, and everything's running a little sluggish, I'm noticing. So give it time, and I'll click on this. And now I've blocked everything but the lab VPC relevant resources. And now I can see my subnets. If I come down to my route tables, I can see the route tables. And when I come down to my internet gateway, I can see my internet gateway. Notice they're all tagged with a lab, and that is a tag. So if I select this, you'll notice that it has a tag, a name tag. If I select my route tables and look at each one in turn, take a look there, you can see that name tag that was applied. That's what those are, in fact, name tags. On most of your resources, you'll see some sort of name tag capability. In some cases, there may not be a name tag applied. You can see this VPC here does not have a name tag, although it exists, and it has all kinds of resources attached to it. A name tag was not applied. We'll learn more about name tags and about other types of tags, but it's an important concept because in terms of AWS interacting with the resources, it's your resource IDs that are relevant and that will be unique. I can come in here and I can put exactly the same name on this, but it's a name tag. So that will not create a conflict other than confusion. So be aware that name tags do not have to be unique. And in fact, many cases you don't want them unique, but in this case, it's just creating confusion. So I'm going to hit save to clear that. So the piece that's unique for any resource is the ID. It's an Amazon resource number. All right, I believe we're at the end of this section here. So we've reviewed what we've created, and we're ready to move on to creating additional subnets in the next section. So I'll see you then.